don't touch anything with the microphone, we'll just activate it.
Good morning to all of you. I see many friends in the room, so it's a real pleasure to have you. And we have an excellent panel for a debate today on voluntary carbon markets. And I think it's very important that also Europe is looking at this, because in the past we did a lot on carbon pricing. We developed an EU ETS. But it's high time also to look at voluntary carbon markets. So I would even say it's very good to be in the European Pavilion discussing the issue today with an excellent panel. And we have Richard Newell, who is the president and the CEO of Resources for the Future in the United States. Richard has been following a lot about climate change over decades, and in particular on carbon pricing. So Richard, we are very eager to have your views. And we have Princess Mashal Ashalam from Saudi Arabia, that is venturing also now on carbon pricing. So that's a very big achievement, I think, and a very important step forward. So we are very much looking forward to your insights and views from the kingdom. We have Jan Corneli, who is a senior research associate from the European University Institute in Florence. And Jan is looking at the new regulation that is coming up on disclosure of information by corporates and the financial sector. And we have David Radermacher, who is Vice President Sustainability of E.ON Company in Germany. Very pleased to have a company here who is venturing as well on the voluntary carbon market along the obligations on the EU ETS. So a distinguished panel, and I'm really pleased that we could have this discussion today. A few practical things. if the sound is not good, please use the headphones. That is what I'm being told. If it is more easy to follow the debate with headphones, you, I think, have them in your neighborhood. We have also Andrea Abrahams with us online. And Andrea is from IETA, very deeply involved in the ICVCM, the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets. And so the private sector perspective is going to be added as well in this debate. So Andrea, pleased to have you online. So we have also an audience online. This event is being recorded and web streamed and is going to be accessible also on the website after the event. Now, without much further ado, I really would look forward to an informal debate, looking at how we could use the opportunity of the voluntary carbon market. And the opportunity means integrity. And it means serving the purpose, net zero. So, Richard, if I may turn first to you about, what role would you see for the voluntary carbon market in the context of net zero by 2050 or as soon as possible? Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Jas, and thanks so much for gathering us together for what's a really timely and I think important conversation. And it's really emanating from, I think, some very good developments. So if you take the long view on this and you think about the evolution of both national, international, and also corporate focus on climate change, we've evolved over time from early days focusing on global concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We've focused on temperature targets, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. But it really wasn't until we got to focus on emissions, and in particular net zero emissions, that actions have become much more concrete. And when you think about net zero emissions, it's also coupling two things. It's including both our emissions, and it's also including removals. This is very important because we are continuing to emit. We recognize that we are going to need to be removing emissions from the atmosphere. It also opens and expands the different technological and action opportunities for stabilizing the climate. Now, the other thing about net zero emissions is it's a concept that's actionable at multiple levels. We can think about net zero emissions into the atmosphere to stabilize the global climate. We can think about country level, national level net zero emission targets. And we can also think about it at the level of an institution like a corporation. And I think this has been a very healthy development that also directly connects to the notion of a voluntary carbon market. So until we're in a world where all of the emissions globally are under some kind of a compliance regime, not only emissions but also removals are under some kind of a compliance regime, there will be value in some type of a voluntary carbon market. Just to think about that for a moment. And we are a very long distance from right now from having every ton of emissions and removals globally being under some kind of a compliance regime. So once you recognize that, but yet you want to expand opportunities and allow flexibility, that's additional, you immediately get to a world where you recognize that we need different instruments and different mechanisms for doing this. So let's talk about crediting mechanisms, which is really how the voluntary carbon markets comes in. And let's just think briefly about the supply side and the demand side of crediting mechanisms. So on the supply side, crediting mechanisms really come in three forms. We have international crediting mechanisms, which take the form of, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism and the mechanisms that will be developed under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. We also have compliance crediting mechanism at the domestic level. We have in the United States the California Offset Program. We have offset programs in Canada, in Switzerland, in China. We also have crediting mechanisms against emission tax regimes in different countries, right? So that's a different source of supply of credits. And then we have independent certification institutions like Verra and the Gold Standard, which are also mechanisms for crediting carbon. So that's the supply side. And you can see already, you see a mix of compliance regimes that are crediting offsets of different types and also kind of voluntary schemes that are in the civil society, in the non-government sector. So that's the supply side. On the demand side, you have a kind of a parallel. You have international demand, countries wanting to achieve their nationally determined contributions. And you also have things like CORSIA, international aviation, where we also have an international compliance regime that is going to allow for offsets to be in there. Then we have the domestic regimes on the demand side, same there on the supply side and then demand side. And then finally, what we're focusing our conversation on today is voluntary commitments by corporations usually as part of their net zero targets, which is a very important and the most important growing source of demand. So, and I'll just close in a second. So just to place this in context, so you immediately start to see, one question that comes up is the relationship between compliance mechanisms and voluntary mechanisms. They are innately attached through the marketplace in the way that I just said. And so we need to keep an eye on how standards are developed in each of those regimes because they will be influencing one another. The vast increase in voluntary carbon markets has really evolved really taken off over the last couple of years, and that has a lot to do with net zero commitments by corporations. And so if we want those net zero commitments to be additional, meaning that they actually remove emissions that wouldn't otherwise occur, either remove them from the atmosphere or avoid them from occurring. There's going to be a number of other steps, which I'm sure we'll get into this discussion, that are kind of lay underneath additional. That market is now estimates between $1 and $2 billion per year. Some forecasts are that could get up to like $10 billion a year. So this is significant resources. So I'll stop there, Joss. Hopefully that helps to seed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Richard. It is. And there is one element I picked up that may be the subject of our debate here, that is the influence that compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets may have on one another. It's particularly relevant in the European context. So let's park that point for our discussion later this morning. And I move to Marshall. You are the co-founder of Eon Collective, who have been making the debate on carbon pricing in Saudi Arabia. Now, we heard the news lately that you are taking off in Saudi Arabia with some voluntary carbon market initiatives. I'm sure many people in the room are eager to hear more about that. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joss. Maybe if you allow me, I'd like to start with why Saudi Arabia is choosing to do what it's doing. I think something that a lot of people forget is the vulnerability that the region is facing and a lot of climate change impacts and implications. So we are at the hot zone of a lot of the temperature increases. We are in a youthful, skewing population as well. So where a lot of people are seeing it as their baseline as a huge maybe risk or a challenge, we're seeing it as an opportunity in terms of growth. So to go back to some of the themes that Richard has just mentioned, the importance of integrity for Saudi Arabia is extremely important because as we restructure our own economy, as we're shifting away from a fossil fuel-based economy, and we're talking a lot about diversification, it's not an easy undertaking because I guess topics and terms like a transition make it seem very simple, as if you're dialing up and dialing down certain types of solution, when in essence you're completely revising the DNA and the core structures of what's happening there. So that requires a lot of clarity and integrity in what you're issuing within those markets. The second is the shift that's happening in Saudi Arabia from an oil and gas ecosystem for Saudi Arabia becoming, if you allow me this pun, the Saudi Arabia of energy. So we're really looking very seriously into hydrogen, into opportunities within CCUS, into opportunities within solar and renewables. So these are very important things that we see as part and parcel of how we're seeing our transition within the country. And the last and most important component is, again, the power of our youth. So where we see a lot of jobs that are being created and impacts and implications on the GDP, we're seeing, in essence, probably a shift towards thinking of what are these future jobs of actively repairing our planet looking like, and how can we ensure that these are good-paying jobs, one that have clarity and stickiness, but ones that actively contribute to a redefinition of how we look at our GDP and our growth. And Saudi has committed to net zero by 2060. Some might argue that that's a longer time horizon, but to those who know us, we take the Bedouin approach, and that's something that I call under-committing and over-delivering. And when we're seeing a lot of what's happening within the kingdom with our own, let's say, ratchet mechanism of the SGI, these are conferences where we're inviting everyone who's joining us online as well, to see us walk the talk. So how do we ensure that this is happening in a concrete and tangible way? How do we measure it? How do we uplift one another and talk less within the us versus them mentality, but more within this we of what we need to be delivering? And I'll touch on a few more maybe points where I'd really love to give the floor to others and, with open hearts and ears and opportunities for co-learning. What Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund has done in collaboration with Tadawul Group is the development of a regional voluntary carbon market. And I think, Joss, between yourself and I in early discussions, we were thinking, well, this needs to be a regulated form of that. And we're seeing this taking shape. There's around 500 million riyals in capital, so that's around $133 million. Also, this first year, they've launched their first auction around the sixth edition of the FII, where they've auctioned around 1.4 million tons of carbon credits. What was really interesting for me to see is not only the variety of the companies that took part of this, so it was a mix between public-private owned companies like NEOM, like SABIC, like Aramco, but also private players like the Alayan Financing Company and Abdulatif Jameel Company and others. And this is being opened up to more of a regional kind of approach. But what really struck me was the high quality of both the carbon credits that were issued that were Verra registered and compliant. Also, this kind of thinking that's starting to emerge is that by the creation of the carbon markets themselves, usually when these carbon credits are issued, it takes the period of around 6 to 7 years for these to be translated to projects on the ground. So there's already a discussion of this creation of a fund in parallel to this to ensure that this is hastening. We have a very short and tight deadline to reach a lot of our goals and targets. So how do you hasten and ensure that this is being translated into action on the ground? I'm not going to touch too much, and I'll leave this room for discussions around the green sukuks that have been gaining momentum, as well as the PIF raising of $3 billion in debt for the capital market to sort of help deliver for a lot of the green projects that are happening in the kingdom by 2026. The last thing that I'm going to touch on probably sort of alludes to Article 6. And we saw, for those of you who have tuned in to the Saudi Green Initiative discussions, a cool banter between Alok Sharma and Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, who was our Minister of Energy, around what needs to be created. First thanking him to finalizing the Paris rulebook, and that sends a very clear signal for the rest of the countries of the issuance. What we'll see being developed, again, for the non-private sector, this issuance of a GHG credit market that will be launched in the beginning of 2023. So not many details have been out thus far, but we're keeping a very close eye on. And again, the assurance that this is not us trying to do any kind of window dressing, any kind of greenwashing, but this is very serious exercise of survival within the area. It's also a recognition that no one country can do it alone, that we need to be collaborating a lot more as this ecosystem is being redefined around the globe, because this will create also a lot of dissonance within the system. And again, the more that we can use these as opportunities of co-learning, of co-creating, the stronger that this would be.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mashal. And I was struck by two elements in what you said. That is the emphasis on the new technologies that we will need. You mentioned hydrogen. Of course, in Europe and elsewhere, there is a lot of attention to green hydrogen. You mentioned CCS, these technologies, and they could be encouraged through the development of the voluntary carbon market. That's one element. But also seen from a governance point of view, you said we are looking for a regulated voluntary carbon market. So that needs to be deepened out, I think, and eager to have in our discussion perhaps more elements brought forward on that. What needs to be regulated? Because we call it a voluntary carbon market, but still, some minimum level of regulation may be necessary. And that's the perfect transition to Jan Corneli from the EUI, who has been digging into some of this new legislation coming up on transparency. So Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And indeed, when talking about quality and the integrity of carbon credits, usually, and a lot of the discussion is about the production of these credits, about the supply side, questions of additionality, permanence, monitoring, reporting, verification, all these elements. And obviously those are very important, and I think Andrea will touch upon those from the viewpoint of the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon markets. But our thinking is that that's not enough to regulate or to have binding standards on the supply side alone. We also need to look at the demand side and at the quality of the exchanges, the commercial transactions that are taking place. And there are new rules being developed which can help to work towards the quality and the integrity of this whole market. And particularly on the demand side, Jos mentioned in the introduction that the EU has not been very active necessarily on the voluntary carbon market, given the compliance markets of the EU ETS. But actually, when you look at regulation of the demand side, I would say that the EU is actually very much at the forefront of it. Because last week, in the European Parliament, there's been a vote on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will in the future, in the next 5 years, will oblige all big corporates of Europe, 50,000 in total in the end, to report on sustainability each year. And it's the most comprehensive set of legally binding rules on ESG. There's a lot of talk about ESG, but here it is law. It will become law. It's now the Parliament who has voted, the Council will come later. Now, if you look at that, there's 15 chapters of standards which have been prepared in draft. One of them is on climate mitigation and adaptation. And within that chapter, there's actually the first standard on the use of carbon credits by a corporation. So you are a big corporation, like E.ON, and you buy voluntary carbon credits. You will need to report each year how this contributes to your corporate net zero target. Where are these credits coming from? Who has verified them? Are they EU, non-EU? Are they nature-based, technology-based? How will they be cancelled, and at which rhythm will they be cancelled in the next year? So all of this information will need to be there in a legally binding way and will be controlled afterwards by sort of sustainability auditors and will be open for the public to verify. And I think that that will be a game changer on the use of carbon credits by corporates in order to achieve their net zero goals. This transparency on the reporting is very important in order to have also pressure, because if you look at the general public and sort of ONGs who are watching this market, and I think it's a very good idea that the civil society pressure there. Obviously, you can look at those who create the credits. You can also look at the ones who use it, that they are truthful about their use and about the quality of what they are having. And the EU is there with this regulation. It will enter into force. The first period will be 2024, reporting in 25, and then let's say the group of corporates will be gradually expanded. So it means also in terms of timing, and that's the last point I would like to make here. In terms of timing, we see this nascent market, and there's a lot of initiatives all over the place. Now, first reporting period 2024, we'll learn from that. We'll see, how does it work, what is being reported. There will be some scrutiny. So you're going into 25, 26, 27, so you'll have some cycles of reporting before this whole edifice, this legal infrastructure is very much alive and doing the function that it needs to do. And so I think we're looking at 3 to 5 years of learning from this data, learning from this disclosure and reporting by corporates, and I think that will reflect positively on also those who produce the carbon credits, so that they know where to navigate to. If E.ON wants to buy, you will need to know what is the standard here, because they will be scrutinized for it. And I think that's a healthy market discipline, which has its origin in legally binding directive of the European Union. I'll stop it there for the moment.
Thank you, Jan, for putting the emphasis on regulation is coming. And it's going to be a scrutiny on the demand side for the credits. So far, and I'm looking forward, Andrea, in a moment to have your input, the supply side was controlled on its integrity. This is now a complementary approach from the demand side. But first, I would like to pass the floor to David. You are a company, a power company, an important one in Europe. You have your obligations under a raft of legislation, including under the ETS. How are you approaching these voluntary initiatives?
Yeah, thank you, Jos. First of all, I have to pick up the topic of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive quickly, and I'm very pleased we're talking about impact and voluntary carbon markets today and not about corporate reporting, because there are definitely pros and cons to this, and a lot of the reporting that's coming up is boosting transparency and boosting auditing and consulting firms. But that's on a side note. I think if we do some recap on the dynamics of the negotiations here, of the spirit at COP, we have to face it. This is not a time where we pick and choose over voluntary carbon markets versus decarbonization efforts, reduction efforts. It's the voluntary carbon market is not questioned anymore whether it will come and play a role, but just how, and how it will be accelerated. And from a corporate perspective, we're approaching it from our customer perspective. We have customers that have unavoidable emissions short term because the speed of reduction is very different from industry to industry. So the voluntary carbon market will play an important role if it is set up in an appropriate manner, in a level playing field, where corporate money can be redirected to nature-based solutions, to technological solutions, to complement reduction efforts. And integrity is the key word right now on three phases. Integrity of the projects on the supply side, integrity on the trading, on the exchange, and integrity of the use case, so the corporate use case. If I have a company that has science-based targets and a clear decarbonization path, clear reduction path, voluntary carbon credits on top are true additionality. And that's what's important right now, redirecting cash flows. And this is where we see our role. We as E.ON, being a fully downstream focused energy company in Europe, speak with the voice of 50 million customers in Europe. We bring that customer demand on decarbonization into the markets, and we want to play an important role also in the exchange and the trading of carbon credits. We're heavily investing both bringing the demand into the markets, but also in creating a blockchain-based platform that can actually play a key role in creating traceability and integrity and solving that integrity problem.
Thank you, David. This is very intriguing and important for the European context. We have a lot of legislation, but legislation is only covering a part of the emissions, so there is a lot of scope for additional efforts, and that is where your company is giving an example of how this could be done. So thank you for that. And a lot of questions may come as well, on what is the duplication or not in view of the new legislation coming. But before we go into the discussion, Andrea, I would like to address myself to you. You have been deeply involved in the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets out of the IETA federation. So what is the perspective now? You had the consultation phase in the Integrity Council. The material is there. What can we expect next as an exercise to improve the integrity? Because we are all unisono, insisting on integrity. So the floor is yours, Andrea, in particular on the ICVCM.
Thank you, Jos, and hello, everybody. Nice to be back at COP in week 2, even be it virtually. So I head up the voluntary carbon market activities within IETA, and in that capacity as IETA, we sit on the secretariat of the ICVCM and get involved day to day there. Just before I dip into your question, though, Jos, you had also sort of asked me just to reflect on a couple of the points that have been made, and I just wanted to reiterate that in the many activities and events I joined on voluntary last week, I think integrity was mentioned certainly much more than once in every single one of those. So it's absolutely the name of the game. And I think I really like what Richard said. This isn't about, what David said, sorry, this isn't about whether the voluntary carbon market's going to have a role to play. It is simply about how we do it and getting there more quickly. I think this COP, more than any other, has really reiterated the role that the voluntary carbon markets can play, in particular now as we sort of have the ramp up to the Article 6 rulebook. There's such a space for this market, which is already established, to scale and to play the critical roles that various speakers played in terms of accelerating critical technologies like hydrogen, like CCUS, etc. So I think integrity, as it has been framed in this discussion, touches on the whole value chain of carbon markets, both on the supply side and on the demand side. Moving to the supply side, and then I'd like to pick up 1 or 2 points on the demand side that hopefully will add to the discussion so far. On the supply side, there are, various infrastructure. There's a lot of infrastructure that is already in place that is of high integrity. I think that's important first point to make. It's not as if we are starting from a blank sheet of paper. And I sometimes get concerned that people think of the ICVCM as the first integrity initiative. It's certainly not. It's building on the excellent work that is being done by Vera, by Gold Standard, by the various standards, by the registries, and by the project developers and the VVBs. But what the ICVCM is trying to do is set the threshold standard so that it's in many ways easier to understand what quality is, because this is a complicated market. There are many players, and it's complicated for very good reason, frankly. There's a huge number of carbon offset types of projects. So there is a reason for the complexity, but it makes it very difficult for buyers to interpret what quality is and do that simple task of buying a high quality credit that is unquestionable. So that's what really the Integrity Council is trying to do. And it's an extremely tough task, and they're working very hard at it. The public consultation has now closed, and there were 5,000 comments submitted by over 300 organizations representing 100 countries. So all of this input is being sort of consolidated and reviewed. Not surprisingly, there are completely polarizing views within this. So trying to kind of navigate a path through this is really not easy. Some of the key issues which have come up, and obviously I can't give you a sense of the direction of travel because it's mid being decided, but some of the key issues that were raised were issues of phasing. How do you phase in the threshold? So it's almost a balance between ambition and pragmatism so that there's no delay in the market. There's been a lot of discussion on the technical aspects. So how do we assess additionality, permanence, leakage, etc.? There's been a lot of discussion on Paris alignment. So should voluntary carbon market credits align with some of the Paris rulebook? So things like share of proceeds, things like contribution to overall mitigation outcomes, as well as the question of should all carbon credits coming out of the ICVCM, so these would be the core carbon principles, CCP credits, should they all be correspondingly adjusted? So various views on that. So I'll leave it at that in terms of the ICVCM. Just to pick up a point on the demand side integrity. So great points raised on increasing regulation, increasing rigor. I would call out a few other announcements that happened last week at COP, which are really important in terms of setting the rules and the regulations. So first of all, we had the UN high-level expert group talking about guidance on net zero and having issued a report. I certainly think that's worth people reflecting on and reading. I think it's a very helpful addition and sets perhaps some global guidance, which is important. The other piece of global guidance has come from ISO in their net zero guiding principles, which have also now been launched. This again sets guidance on net zero and the use of carbon offsets within that. I think I think it was Jan was alluding to, I think the increase in regulation is really important, but the challenge that we have is that corporates are global, corporates are multinational, and they need guidance that's applicable and relevant globally, not only in one jurisdiction. So that's going to be really important. So guidance on what net zero means, that's consistent globally, guidance and consistency on the use of carbon credits for corporates within a net zero. And those are critical components to pulling through the demand. My final point, there are a lot of new supply initiatives that have been launched. We heard the one from Saudi Arabia. There was a very big one launched, the African Carbon Markets Initiative. There was the John Kerry Initiative. So lots of supply initiatives being launched. We need buyers for all these supply initiatives. So really important to get the claim side right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you for making that point at the end, because a market means buyers and sellers, so you need both in balance with one another. Otherwise, if there is imbalance, the prices go to zero. We know that in Europe. We had it in the first phase of the EU ETS. Thank you very much. Excellent contributions, a very differentiated picture. I pick up, Andrea, from what you said. It's a very complicated market because there are so many different initiatives out there. I would classify only two: removals versus technology, which is a main topic that may arise in the debate. And also what you were calling on, there is the new UN high-level initiative, the McKenna initiative. There is the ISO, so very useful to recall that. I'm opening the floor, and we have a full audience here today, so prepare your questions. I simply wanted to ask the panelists if what they heard from one another, if there are specific comments they would like to make or questions they want to make to one another in order to deepen the discussion. But then I come to the audience and also to those in the web stream who would may want to come forward. The floor is open. So I see David may want to come in, and Mashal may want to come in, and Jan. Okay, David, you start.
Thank you, Andrea. We highly appreciate your efforts in creating a level playing field. I would like to add one point, one aspect to what you said is pragmatism. We are right now in a situation where we discuss a lot about wording. What is net zero? What can you claim when you use carbon credits? We'll talk a lot about regulation. And it's actually the fact that we cannot have this discussion stop us from doing the right things. The dynamic in the voluntary carbon market that is coming up is really redirecting money in nature-based solutions, in technology, and we're distracted by discussions on reporting. So I think it's important to always keep that pragmatism in mind. And I know, as you say, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. I believe right now there's the good, the better, and there's always the ugly in that market environment. So creating a level playing field is important for corporates. We need rules, we need integrity, as I said, but we also need to stay pragmatic.
Thanks, David. A good point. We learned it in Europe the hard way. We had to start pragmatic with an imperfect system, and over time, you make it better and better. Mashal, you have.
Thank you, Joss. Maybe I'll start it with a comment, then a question to my colleagues. At the first, and I've been tuning in very closely to what Honorable McKenna has mentioned in this high-level ambitions of what quantifies a net zero pathway. Something that I remind myself, obviously we're always pushing for ambition as civil society in Saudi, but that there are sometimes some short-term goals and targets that come and collide with these long-term ambitions that we do have. So when we're stating that certain parts of the energy mix cannot be looked into, by definition and by default, you're already sidelining whole economies that could be playing a very vital role in terms of unlocking the full potential of some of the technologies that are needed. So if we're really thinking about these hard-to-abate sectors, and again, if we're thinking about being inclusive in how we're transitioning, to quote myself, transforming our ecosystems, right? There has to be an inclusive pathway for us to be able to achieve that, but one that really focuses on the emission side of the equation. So how can we tackle the emission? How can we deliver a pathway that's, let's say, agnostic to what that energy mix looks like, as long as the emissions are dealt with the highest level of transparency and integrity within the process? And the question that I have for my fellow colleagues, this is something that I've been pondering a lot, and maybe we've touched on in our panel yesterday, is that sometimes we forget that as we're dealing with the climate crisis, we have other crises that are in the mix. So we are at COP27, but COP15 is around the corner in Montreal, right? So there's a whole biodiversity crisis where the risk that we're really trying to tackle here is almost a dinosaur level sort of extinction if we don't tackle it in a real and meaningful way. And sometimes reaching some of those goals and targets on the climate side do not necessarily meet those goals on the biodiversity side. I'll allude very shortly to a short story that I've witnessed firsthand in Costa Rica while we were vacationing and visiting some friends in the Osa Peninsula. As you're moving from one secondary forest to a beautiful primary forest, we saw these highways being severed with these highly compliant, highly integrity-oriented carbon credits. This is how I see them, but these are monocultural trees that within the span of the credit that was issued, they're essentially biodegrading the soil and the ability of the soil to continue to do its work, but are also severing highways for certain types of monkeys that rely on their tails to move from one tree to the other. So how do we do this in a way that's also inclusive to other animals and other beings that we're sharing this planet with?
Thank you, Michelle. A very important element, the non-climate kind of benefits, in terms of biodiversity, environment, social, whatever, more than just climate. That is the point you want to make. I pass the microphone to Jan.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to react on some of the points made. Perhaps just briefly the last one. Indeed, we need to look at this in an integrated way. And in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of the EU that I talked about, the reporting is on ESG, it's on all the elements of nature, biodiversity, pollution, oceans, and so forth, and also on social. Now, on the question on the guiding principles and the guidance that was launched last week, I think we need to be very clear about what is voluntary. It's a voluntary carbon market, so it means it's voluntary commitments and it's voluntary purchases of these allowances. But the transparency should not be voluntary, and that's where I find the regulatory point comes in. Transparency is not voluntary, and that's in two ways not voluntary. One, and that's I think where the EU is again showing leadership with this Corporate Social Sustainability Reporting Directive. It doesn't say what you have to report, it says that it's obliged to be transparent about every important element of these credits. You don't need to buy them. You don't need to go to net zero. You can stick to your European objectives. But if you do, you'll be transparent. And that's a legal obligation. And I think it's important because I don't believe in a completely voluntary market. I think there's elements of regulation needed to shore up the quality and the integrity. And the second element of the second way of doing that is by financial market regulation. Because exchanging low quality carbon credits is fraud. Being dishonest about the quality of these credits, it's a financial crime. And so there I think we need to use the instruments of the financial sector that are already in place in order to make sure that if you enter one of these exchanges, if you enter these trading platforms, you are being completely transparent and honest about what you're trading there. So you need rating agencies, you need insurance, you need obviously the reporting on the verification, you need template contracts to get into that exchange. All of that is financial market discipline, but which is based on a legal rule, namely that you cannot sell to financial consumers something which is inherently fraudulent. And so I think it's very important that we don't get this wrong. Voluntary is in the trade, is in the commitment, it's not in the transparency. It has to be a legal basis in order to have corporates and financial market participants sticking to their legal obligations. I think that's what I wanted to add here.
Okay, well, thank you. David wanted to briefly react to that, and then we come to Richard. David?
Thank you, Richard. Just a brief reaction. I think in terms of transparency, you're absolutely right. We need the transparency, but re-emphasizing the pragmatism, I really would like to see the Bedouin approach, Mashal said, under-committing, over-delivering on this too, because it's we're right now in a phase where we're drowning the dynamics through reporting, through bureaucracy, and I know I'm the German representative in this round. We shouldn't be too German on this.
Okay, well, it's a very good comment. Thank you. Richard, and then I turn to Andrea if Andrea wants to react to what was said. Richard.
Yeah, I did want to react, I think it was to two things Michelle actually said, which is first on the what you could call co-benefits, and thinking not just about the climate benefits, but the other benefits and negative consequences that might be associated with different market mechanisms and crediting mechanisms, but to think about that not necessarily just from the point of view of animals, but also from people in the countries where many of these projects are taking place. And I definitely hear more of this as a very important thing for us to keep in mind, which is what are the local benefits to those countries and those communities beyond the climate benefits. That's, I think, going to be an increasingly important part of the integrity of these different projects. But I wanted to also react to something else Michelle said, and I don't have a solution to this, and I'm going a bit out on a limb, which is that 80% of our global energy system is still dependent on fossil fuels. That needs to change, that will change, it will take time. And if we don't find ways, whatever they are, as part of existing protocols or additional protocols, if we don't find ways for those companies and those countries to participate in the solution and to make progress, we are missing huge opportunities, and I think it will slow us down, not speed us up. If those entities in those countries aren't part of the solution. So I think we really do need to figure out the way. And I mean, it does echo a little bit of what you're saying also about, like, we have to be a little bit careful about purism because it can actually set us back at different times.
Okay, an important trade-off to be made, one way or the other. Andrea, a brief reaction on what was said so far, or shall we go to the audience? It's your call.
I think only to reiterate this balance between pragmatism and getting things 100% right is absolutely critical. I mean, the evidence is that the market is hesitating because of the fear of corporates of doing the wrong thing. And that's not right. We can't have that. We have to have everybody being really bold and participating as best they can while the guidance and the regulation emerges. So how do we give that confidence to corporates that it is much better to participate in the carbon market and the energy transition than hold back and wait? Really important point. So thank you.
Thank you. Just a brief reaction from my side on that. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, there are many corporations who shy away from the voluntary carbon market because of reputational risk. They do not want to burn their fingers on, one or the other court case that we saw in many cases in Europe, where corporates were, having quite significant rulings they had to follow up on. So if there is more transparency and a regulatory framework that creates confidence, then more people may be attracted to the voluntary carbon market instead of the other way around. So it's a difficult trade-off to be made between pragmatism and purism. That's just the comment I wanted to make. But I wanted to turn to the audience because there are many important players here in the voluntary carbon market. And I see a question by Billy Pfizer. I see a question over there. Is there someone coming around with a microphone, please? Yes. Okay. So they have 2 questions. Let's take 3 questions. And we have a question there. Okay. The gentleman, Billy, you raise your hand. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Billy Pfizer at Resources for the Future. This has been an excellent panel and discussion. One question I have is, when I think about voluntary markets, to me the defining feature, as a couple of people have said, is this is voluntary. And so in my mind, a defining feature has to be companies are only going to be willing to pay a certain amount before they say this just isn't worth it. How does that feature, do you agree with that? And how does that feature affect, what we can expect or what we shouldn't expect from voluntary carbon markets?
Thank you. And then the gentleman behind you. Yeah, okay.
Hi, Matt from Wildlife Works. And David, how do you see E.ON screening credits going forward, at least in the short term while there's so much uncertainty? Are you kind of relying on the verification standards as they are now, or do you anticipate doing further internal due diligence?
Okay, thank you. There was a question here, and then besides, yes, perhaps we take 5 questions in a row, and then we come back to the panel in the benefit of time. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. I'm David from EPE, French Business Network. Thank you for the quality of the debate. If I try to rephrase the end of the discussion, it's going to be about how can we achieve the highest level of quality of the carbon credit at the lowest cost. And in this way, would a minimal price on carbon credit be interesting? So I will be eager to know what you think about that.
Thank you. Good question. Sir, yeah, thank you.
Many people believe that if you only look at scope 1 and 2 in your carbon credit, that really there's a lot of the picture that's left out. If you don't take scope 1, 2, and 3 into your calculation, how is this being looked at in the legislation and from your perspective as to create that reliability and trust?
Okay, thank you. Can you shift the microphone? So the scope question.
Thank you. My name is Eric ten Hark. I'm the chairman of the Benelux Business Roundtable. My question is very simple. I agree with Jos's assessment that companies, corporations will shy away from entering the voluntary market if there is a reputational issue, potentially. Now, how long will it take for the regulators to come to the perfect system? We are here at COP where solutions are required now. That's what you hear in most of the sessions. If this regulatory rule book will take too much time, is that not a threat to the idea of the voluntary market itself?
Thank you. Very good questions, I would think. And there is one almost for each of you. So do not try to reply on all questions, but pick the one on which, David, you were directly addressed in one of the questions.
Thanks for the question. And I'll pick up the last question very briefly, because I think it's right, companies will shy away to some extent only if there's reputational issues, because it, for us, in the end, only narrows down the room to maneuver. And that's actually what we do. You asked about our efforts going forward. We've clearly defined our due diligence process, and we've defined where to play in this dynamic market. So we've set ourselves quality guideline. We are excluding a wide range of credits from our efforts, and at the same time, in this dynamic market environment, we're appropriately reflecting our customer demand, the willingness to pay at customer side, because carbon credits at E.ON are not taken into account for our own decarbonization efforts. Our climate targets are part of board remuneration. All executives' bonuses are linked to our decarbonization efforts, and carbon credits are not relevant for this. This is always on top, that's always additional, and we're bringing in the willingness to pay from our customers, and that's how we maneuver. But agreed, there needs to be some regulation in place, otherwise the space where you don't see an appropriate risk balance is simply too small.
Thank you, David. Jan?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting questions, and I would like to respond to all of them, but that's not going to be feasible. Just take two together. The scope. If we reason from a science-based perspective, you reduce your scope 1, 2, 3, and then additional, you have the carbon credits. And I think in your reporting, that's the essential point. You will need to be transparent on what you do yourself. Beyond your legal reduction obligations and what you do with carbon credits. And that's connected to the question, when do you stop that? Or when, and I think it's, we'll have to learn to be mature about it. And on a macro level, we're learning this the hard time right now. At some points, you might be off track. Just like the EU right now is burning more coal because of the energy crisis, but we keep the targets. We keep the price, we keep the ETS going. So we keep the machinery and the targets going, so our net zero commitment is not in danger. It will be a bad year in terms of emissions. And I think corporates will have to be transparent on whatever they do. They can step out of their net zero commitments, they can. But they will have to explain and face the reputational risk. Now at some point, they might make the calculus that the financial risk is higher than the reputational, and just say, look, we are stepping out of our commitment. It is possible, but then they will have to be transparent about it. And that's, I think, where the maturity of the market is also there. And that's also, lastly, pragmatism is good in setting up the system, but you don't want to have a market that doesn't even reach maturity because the price immediately plummets, or it's something where corporates are afraid to step into. And so let the market mature, but always based on transparency. That would be my summary on many of the questions.
Thank you. Mashal?
Yeah, maybe I'll reflect a bit on what you've said. Just a reminder, for myself included, is that the voluntary carbon market has to be working really well and in close dynamics with the rest of the policy options that are on the table. So I'll give it with concrete examples in Kingdom. For one, for SABIC, for example, I recall congratulating their chief environmental officer or whoever runs in those ranks, because they've ranked on the least in terms of the top 10, let's say, who have gotten offsets off of the market. They were at the very bottom, and it's because their strategy is starting to already look at scope 3, but also they're seeing and they're vying, because they are a multinational chemical-based market, is that offset is the choice that's least favored. So once all of your other options have been out of the table, then that's when you pick to go on the offset route. So that's important to remember, that different companies deal with it in different ways. And the other than maybe only talking about the stick approach, it's good to talk about the carrots as well. We're starting to see this emerge in a lot of the companies in Kingdom, where a lot of the bonuses for the CEOs are sort of tied to meeting ESG targets. So having those kinds of carrots are also important.
Very good. Thank you. There are two questions that were not yet explicitly addressed. The minimum price for carbon credits
I can
and the
do that one,
willingness
Jos.
to pay. Okay, Richard, because we are close to the end of the session, that's why I just wanted to make sure. Richard.
I think this is a quick answer. Now, in a compliance market and emission trading system, there's very good reasons why one might want to have a minimum price, a price floor, and a price ceiling to stabilize the market and to take advantage of low-cost emission reductions rather than not taking advantage of those. In the context of a voluntary carbon market, there should absolutely be quality minimums. That's the whole conversation about integrity. But in terms of a price minimum, I don't actually see a reason why one would want that. Now, if you started seeing very, very low prices, that might lead you to question integrity if you don't believe that the world has such cheap opportunities. But I think the way to adjust that would not be in any way to put a price minimum. It would be to think about integrity.
Thank you, Richard. And Andrea, your last word?
So yeah, I would agree with that point on price. Remember, the underlying cost of abatement differs based on the type of abatement, so that always impacts on price. There's lots of interesting discussions going on around price at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see where this plays out. So one of them is that correspondingly adjusted credits through the Paris through Article 6 should actually cost a lot more than those that are not correspondingly adjusted, because that host country has to make up for that emission reduction that it sold. So it'll be interesting to see where that comes out. But I guess I'll end on the point that don't forget that it's voluntary and there is not endless elasticity in what corporates are going to be able to pay for credits. So let's just bear that in mind.
Thank you, Andrea. We come to the end of our discussion already. It's a very interesting number of points that were raised by an excellent panel. But I take two, three issues out of the debate. The first is that we all agree integrity is important. There is no doubt about that. There are lots of initiatives, the ICVCM and many others, including the UN High-Level Initiative, the ISO that was brought to the fore by Andrea. So lots of things going on. So we all agree. Then the second point is how to do it. And that is where I picked up pragmatism versus pluralism. I picked up regulations, but are we sure which ones? I think there are many views out there where we also saw many elements raised is removals versus technology, reduction of emissions. But given the net zero, I think what works. That was a little bit what was said, and let's start with reducing emissions. But let's be very clear, removals are out there and are becoming increasingly important. And the final word is, I think, the distinction that was made about the type of regulations that may come. We were not very clear at the global level or at the national or regional level, etc. But whether the rules should not intervene into the market. But the market on itself needs to be orderly. And that, I think, is coming through the European legislation. The transparency, has to be respected, in a way that goes beyond, I will report what I like to report because it sounds nice. So I think that is the basic element coming through. But I thought we had a very useful and clear discussion between many different viewpoints, but converging all of us on the same basic point. Voluntary carbon markets, if done in an integrity kind of way, high quality kind of way, these voluntary carbon markets have a real important purpose for the net zero, including in Europe. As we are in the European delegation, I think that's a very important point where also Europe, I think, has to invest a little bit more into. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you to the speakers. I think we had an excellent discussion, and I hope that you will have a very nice continuation of your discussions during the day. Thank you very much.